Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to all of you for being here this morning. My name is Cristian Retamal, and I am an associate researcher with the group on governance of climate change at Politécnica University in Cataluña, in Spain. And we have this morning a really interesting panel with participants from mainly the Global South. Isati, please come and join us. Over there, yeah, just on time. And we would like to discuss on different approaches on how participatory dialogues on just and right-based approaches could be used in order to address loss and damage in specific, but also a more just process in the context of the UNFCCC regime. We will have basically 4 interventions from the colleagues here with me. Adrián will be starting. Adrián is director and founder of La Ruta del Clima, a Costa Rica-born initiative doing outreach on climate change. He's also a coordinator of the Climate Action Network Loss and Damage Working Group and a PhD candidate doing research on public participation, human rights, loss and damage, and international climate law. So, Adrián, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you all of you for coming. I know it's extremely hard to be on the almost last day of the event, and it's very nice that you have chosen to accompany us in this journey into justice. And I think one of the things that we reflect on, and my intervention will be more on reflecting on justice, is that sometimes at the national level, and even here, we do not allow us the right to imagine what are the adequate solutions or how can we picture a just reality into our daily lives. And one of the experiences that I had as an NGO advocate here in the past 8 or 9 years is that this process makes you rationalize irrational and unjust processes and decisions, and also even makes you accept premises that are falsehoods in themselves. And then on that double thinking, you start rationalizing course of actions and advocacy options. And we somehow renounce the possibility of creating a juster solution or a just even dialogue or even just sincere. Because sometimes, for example, and you can picture in the issue of finance, we all know that developed countries have finance. And when we take the issue of loss and damage, we are stuck on discussions such as innovative sources of finance, as if there was no finance available. But we play on this, and then we start discussing, and we create papers, and we create discussions on the idea that somehow there is a lack of knowledge or a lack of imagination on how to get finance, when the truth that we all know is that developed countries just don't want to be paid. And we also, for example, in the issue of loss and damage, accept to renounce our rights in terms of compensation, and we inhibit ourselves even to use the word reparations, even though we know it's a right, even though we know that transboundary environmental harm is something that exists in international law, but somehow we neglect and we choose to live and imagine a world where that is not possible, even though we know it's a falsehood. And then we structure dialogues, structure decision-making, structure our own advocacy actions in this sort of falsehoods and ideas that eventually we internalize. And when you are coming from the Global South, it becomes beyond just an advocacy strategy, but it's a loss of dignity, because then you accept that this unjust reality where when you give up rights, when you are unable to imagine a different future, a future where your considerations and your dignity is included in the discussion, something that will never happen. And it's something that it is accepted and becomes part of the structure of climate governance. And this is something that we take very dearly into our thinking, very dearly into what we write. And sometimes it's something that we are addressed as naive as being radical for asking for justice, being radical just for demanding human rights, being radical just for saying what it actually is true. And somehow it's more rational to be realpolitik and just follow out power. But something that in the beginning of this session, I was talking with a student, is that the moment that you accept how power shapes your future, even though you know it's unjust, then somehow you accept to be oppressed. And in the issue of, for example, climate impacts, when we know that this convention has failed its objectives, Article 4 has not been fulfilled, mitigation has never been reduced. Emissions have not been reduced, have not been stabilized. We're not going that way. Adaptation has not been able to take place in a pace that natural system can cope. We know that there's consequences. We know that there's responsibility, but somehow those responsibility and consequences are never there on the table. We're always trying to find ways around it, as if responsibility does not exist, as if justice cannot be something we discuss. And on this idea, and we also see it when we're back home, at least I'm from Costa Rica, and this sort of oppression that structurally harms us and limits our possibility of growth and enjoyment. We see it also in our country. Why cannot I change my surroundings? Why do I have to endure, for example, the noise that I'm always subjected by trucks in front of my house? Why there is no social services? Why there is such inequality? Why? Why do I just accept things as there is? And I think it is time, and I'm not sure how much time I have.
You still have time.
Yeah. It is time. And it is essential, especially when you come from the global south, and especially also in the global north, because I think this is where power lies and where change and resources are located. It is moment that we step back and say, are we just following a process because we're happy of having results but not change? So is it better to be silent and push a process that we know has never worked? Because none of the mechanisms in this convention work, none of them are funded, none of them are effective. And if that's true, would silence and smoothing out the processes and ignoring justice and ignoring our rights, it is really the way to go? Have we done this for 30 years? Do we have any change? Are we in a safer place than in 1992 when the UNFCCC was created? And I myself, and I think the IPCC would agree, we're not. So does following power and promoting discussions in the way that it has been done here, is that okay? And I think it's not. And I would encourage you, and I think that's something many NGOs, especially when the funders and the closeness to power and decision makers outweighs our need to imagine different things and imagine a different society and imagine that we are people with rights, we tend up to just be facilitators. And that's why I would encourage you not to be facilitators, to decide what is the future that you want to live on, what is the present that we can construct together. And that has to be a rational decision, because human dignity is a rational choice. Ignoring and not claiming rights, it is submission to power, and it is not a rational thing to do as a human being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for your intervention. There are certainly a lot of questions that could be raised to the UNFCCC process. And I will leave those questions to the last part of this side event. Now I would like to invite to take the microphone to my colleagues at Politécnica University in Catalunya, Olga and Oliver. Olga is a professor at the Universidad Politécnica de Catalunya, and she currently leads the group on governance of climate change. And Oliver is a PhD student on sustainability at the same university. Olga and Oliver, please.
Thank you, Christian, and thanks to the organizers of this nice side event. We are very pleased to be here presenting the results of our research. If you can display, okay, perfect. Well, in fact, our research group aims to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and policymakers, providing science-based recommendations for policy decisions. Today, we will present our recent analysis on fairness, including equity and ambition in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Now, my colleague Oliver Herrera and myself will present the main results of our work. Next, please. First, Oliver will provide the context about equity, fairness, and ambition in the Paris Agreement. Then he will present the analysis of fairness considerations reflected in the parties' NDCs. Next, I will discuss the concept of the global carbon budget as a key reference for equity, and I will present some results about the differentiated historical responsibilities of parties in the light of equity. And at the end, we will conclude this presentation with the final remarks. Oliver, you have the floor.
Thank you, Olga. Hello to everyone. I'm very glad to be here in this side event with this amazing group of people. In the Paris Agreement, in several paragraphs, we find reference to equity related to the implementation of the agreement. We can read in these two paragraphs, for example. Although parties acknowledge that equity is an important element in implementation, they have not reached consensus on how operationalize it. On the other hand, decision on the adoption of the Paris Agreement requests parties to provide information on how this NDC is fair and ambitious in the light of these national circumstances. And even more, fairness consideration, including reflection on equity, are mandatory from the second NDC, as included in the information for clarity, transparency, and understanding, indicated in the next one of this another decision presented in the slide. Next, please. In this way, our research group has developed an analysis of the information contained in the NDCs regarding fairness consideration. Next. In terms of the scope of the analysis, to put in context, it is important to consider that only was analyzed the information contained in the section on the NDCs specifically dedicated to justify how the party considered its NDC is fair and ambitious. So, information in other sections of the NDC were not considered. The analysis covered all new or updated NDCs submitted by parties between January 2019 and December 2022, corresponding to 171 parties. From these parties, only 148 included a section on fairness and ambition, to say specifically dedicated to this issue. And finally, and very important, the core of the analysis, is that the analysis focus on identify references to 4 principles closely related to fairness in mitigation, which are contained in the Declaration of Legal Principles Related to Climate Change by the International Law Association. These principles of the international environmental law are sustainable development, common but equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and special circumstances and vulnerability. We consider as a reference of this principle, first, the explicit citation of the principle, implicit references, how the concept developed in the arguments present for parties. This, according to the definition of this principle and on the above mentioned declaration. And also, the use of indicators supported by some of these principles. This is based on the work of Rajamani et al. In 2021. Next, please. Let's focus on the results of the analysis. The figure on the left illustrated the parties that included a reference to the principle of equity in the NDC. The points represented countries and they are distributed according to indicators. The vertical axis represents cumulative CO2 emission per capita, and the horizontal axis represents GDP per capita, while the orange line indicates the average value of this indicator. The color on the point represents the classification of countries in the following groups: developed economies, developing economies, and least developed countries, and small island developing states. The figure on the right shows a sum of the graph, where the most of countries are located. It can be seen clearly that this principle is mainly referenced by the group of countries with lower cumulative emission per capita and lower GDP per capita in relation to the world average. Next, please. And regarding the reference to the other principle, situation is very similar in comparison to the principle of equity, as we can see in this figure. Key findings of the analysis are clearly seen in this graph, and they are that parties that provided any kind of reference or consideration on fairness in the NDCs are mostly those with the least historical responsibility for climate change and the least economic capacity to address mitigation and adaptation measures. In the way, LDCs and SIDS countries are those that more frequently apply to fairness principle. And on the other hand, the other side of the situation, there are very few countries with a high historical responsibility and economic capacity that include reference to any principle related to fairness in their argumentations on how their NDC is fair and ambitious. And finally, indicators supported by this principle are rarely used by countries in their fairness consideration. And in general, lack of use of indicators made information hardly comparable. And now I pass the floor to Olga.
Thank you, Oliver. Next, please. Well, the study presented by Oliver complements the findings of other studies in our research group that show very clearly that the Paris Agreement is not being implemented on the principles of equity and CBDR that are pillars of the UNFCCC. And this coincides with the perception of many countries expressing concerns about equity in the current meetings. And we think that a big question that remains to be addressed is how we can operationalize equity. And I would like to shed some light in this issue. In fact, a key physical magnitude that allows us to operationalize the concept of equity in the mitigation component is the global carbon budget. As we will see, on the one hand, it allows us to assess each country's historical responsibility for past emissions, and also it allows us to analyze the extent to which current commitments are equitable. Let me begin with defining the concept of the global carbon budget. Since the fifth assessment report, we know that there is a proportional relationship between the temperature increase and cumulative emissions. And the global carbon budget is defined as the cumulative net carbon dioxide emissions that lead to a given level of global warming. When we talk about cumulative emissions, we refer to the sum of emissions year by year over a period of time. The global carbon budget compatible with the 1.5 degrees goal is very limited, and we have already practically exhausted it. In fact, the sixth assessment report tells us that from the beginning of 2020 until we reach carbon neutrality, there are only 400 gigatons left before exceeding the 1.5 global warming. But today, I will not talk about the remaining carbon budget. Today, I will talk about the part of the carbon budget that has already been consumed. So, I will talk about the common but differentiated responsibilities for past emissions and how we can analyze and assess these responsibilities. And I believe that it's important to address this issue because the failure to achieve mitigation targets, mainly by developed countries, leads us to have to intensify adaptation actions and to engage in the debate on how to deal with loss and damage. Damage and losses that will be huge if we do not manage to increase ambition in mitigation. An important component of equity is responsibility. And we all know that the distribution of historical responsibility is highly inequitable. And keeping in mind the polluter pays principle, the differing responsibility of countries in the current climate crisis should be used to build an equitable framework around the financing of loss and damage. Therefore, in order to assess responsibility for global warming, this is know how much each country has contributed to the temperature increase, we have to do so on the basis of cumulative emissions over history, not on the basis of the ranking of current major emitters. But we also have to take into account that the population of each country is not the same, and that we cannot compare the cumulative emissions over history of two countries with different population volumes. So the key indicator for responsibility is cumulative emissions per capita. These maps show the cumulative per capita emissions of countries. Countries with per capita emissions above the world average are shown in red, with those with cumulative per capita below the world average are shown in green. This is like a map of the global north and global south, with the only exception of fossil fuel producing developing countries. I think that the countries that, based on their historical responsibility, should provide funds for loss and damage are clearly identified here. Next, please. As a recap of what we have explained, we want to briefly summarize two main points of our research. First one, parties that include fairness and equity considerations in their NDCs are mainly the ones with least historical responsibility and least capacity to abate emissions. Since there are no common criteria, we propose a common set of indicators to be used by all parties. These indicators are supported by international environmental law and reflect historical responsibility, socioeconomic reality, and the vulnerability of the country. And second, the global carbon budget provides an analytical framework to operationalize equity. This analytical framework makes it possible to identify the different responsibilities. The analysis presented on country responsibility highlights the large gap that exists in terms of the responsibility between the global north and south. Liability analysis based on equity, together with the polluter pays principle, should be the starting point on who should provide funding for loss and damage. Next, please. And we will end our speech with a reflection that we want to share with all of you. We think that negotiations are in a deadlock, mainly because of clashes between developed and developing countries. We think that if we were able to operationalize equity, we would be able to unlock ambition, because countries, especially developing countries, need to perceive that they are operating within a fair framework. Next, please. And finally, I want to say thanks to all the people that is here and all the contributors that are here named to this work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oliver and Olga, for bringing to this discussion the idea of the carbon budget and the historically accumulated emissions in order to discuss about responsibility and then justice. Now, I would like to give the floor to Isati Citron. Isati is a Puerto Rican climate governance and public participation specialist, Latin American regional coordinator for Citizens Climate International, working on climate governance, right-based climate action, and ethics to expand the civic space at the international, regional, and national levels. Isati, you ready? Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. I am from Puerto Rico, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the loss and damage fund and participation, and then how this relates to islands and, more importantly, well, in this context, territories. So I think that trying to bring something that Adrienne was saying about the limits of the convention and how it permeates in the things that we accept. I think that we should reiterate that one of the key principles for successful implementation of the Loss and Damage Fund is the full effective engagement and consultation of all stakeholders, including indigenous people, local communities, people of color, Afro-descendant communities, migrant people with disabilities, individuals in communities facing impoverishment and dispossession, racial and ethnic minorities, gender and sexual minorities, women and girls, and people living in conflict areas. This is important because we need to recognize the legacies of colonialism and extractivism that have placed these people in vulnerabilities and have affected their adaptive capacity to affront these climate changes. And in addition to the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities, this fund that is addressing the impacts of those who suffer the most, but have contributed the least, must be underpinned by human rights, especially robust and effective participation at all stages. This means the design, the implementation, decision-making, all of it. So when we're talking about loss and damage, we're basically talking about climate justice, and a lot of disproportionate affected communities have identified loss and damage as a centrality issue in the climate justice demand. And climate justice works in 3 different areas. We have the intergovernmental justice, the procedural justice, and the intra-generational justice. The intergovernmental justice, then we talk about those principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. And then procedural justice, I want to hone in the transitional committee and the participation of observers and like engagement of the communities that are affected. So we believe that the transitional committee could do more in trying to bring in the voices of the communities and regions that they represent, in trying to work into how can we engage in at the place, right? Like, can we use like the regional climate weeks? Can we make sure that the way that we are communicating about loss and damage is understandable by everyone? Because everyone knows more or less how climate impacts them. I think that we often don't give enough credit to our communities, but they do understand the basic concepts of climate change and how it affects them. And then they see every day what are they losing, what are the damages that they just simply don't have the capacity to adapt. And then when we're talking about intergenerational and intra-generational, then we need to make sure that those voices are also on the table. So basically, we're talking about make polluters pay, enhance participation in the design process, and make sure that vulnerable communities are an integral part of the governance of the fund, and then also in the implementation. Now, because of the limits of this space, there are states or islands that are not here. They're not represented. But that doesn't mean that climate justice needs to be confined to what this space can do and how we can imagine a fund that goes beyond like what we have envisioned before. So, for example, when we are talking about colonies like my island and others, there are still a lot of non-sovereign states. We see, like, for example, our priorities are not represented in climate strategies. We are definitely treated like second-class citizens, like that's the status, and that is the way that then like climate change strategy, like support and everything then trickles down. Like we are kind of like at the bottom, but we are at the front of the vulnerabilities. We are sidelined in international fora. We have unequal access to broad well-being strategies and financial access. None of the mechanisms that are presented here will work for my island or others that are under this colonial status. And that just puts us in like geopolitical black hole because we don't have anywhere to go other than to the colonizer that do not like really prioritize our needs. And then we have that those same conditions that have, you know, permeated like a legacy of like extraction, colonialism, and then like disinvestment are the same that allow like new waves of colonialism that further entrench vulnerabilities, for example, causing housing issues. Right now, after Hurricane Maria, there was a big exodus of Puerto Ricans. We're talking about 130,000 Puerto Ricans left the island. They were forced to leave the island. There was no way for them to stay. And between that and the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a wave of, you know, people migrating into the island that, you know, certainly discover that they don't need a passport to come to the island, and they have like tax breaks, and they have like established like new businesses and short-term rentals, and this just causes an imbalance in the markets and a boom that doesn't necessarily represent, that definitely doesn't represent the economic status of the island. So it just leaves stranded a lot of people. then we definitely have the impacts of on our resources that are connected to our livelihoods. They're connected to our protection. After Hurricane Maria, we saw an 11% decrease in coral reefs across the island. But when you look at where the hurricane entered, we are seeing on much larger numbers, like 70 or 80%, representing areas that were stored by communities, that they were having projects of restoration, et cetera. So it's impacting both our resource and then also our initiatives to combat climate change. And still, 6 years after the hurricane, we're still rebuilding, we're still trying to recover. There's a lot of mental trauma connected to the hurricane. A lot of houses still don't have a roof because there's so much that disaster funding can do. It's mostly short-lived and under very specific circumstances. So when we're talking about loss and damage and making sure that this actually respond to the people, we need to make sure that we're doing community-based assessment on both what are the needs, but also what will make it better. So we have started a perception study on non-economic losses and damages. This is a little bit complicated because having a society that is not in this forum, then we're starting from scratch. It's like, this is the concept of loss and damage. But we tried to make sure that in this perception study, it was place-based value, like what do they value about the territory, about the island, and then what are their perception of climate change and how they think that they might be impacting, and then experiential coping strategies. So when we asked them what makes Puerto Rico unique for them, we have that 65% talked about generally about natural resources, and this went like from beaches to forests to like biodiversity. 22% talk about cultural and social cohesion, talking about community, the people, family, those values, and then 80% talk about socioeconomic factors, but these were not positive. There were, some of the things that made Puerto Rico unique is like the colonial status, like the way our economy is not really progressing because of all of the things that are imposed on us. And then some of the concerns of climate change losses are cultural identity, like this really massive incoming migrants that are not, we're a very hospital island, but we are just seeing a lot of people coming in, not respecting and really, it's like a new colonialism wave. So it's not necessarily travelers and people that really want to respect and learn about the people that live there. Another concern is biodiversity loss, mental health, life loss and health decline, and the exodus and brain drain. Like we're losing a lot of people, like heavily talented people that are just needed to go somewhere else to find, progress in their life. In terms of some examples of loss and damage compensation, some of it was, we should put corporation tax, debt cancellation, resilient energy infrastructure, dignified adaptation and relocation finance, nature-based solutions, research and technology. So these are basically the findings of the study. Next steps is to refine the survey because we started with key stakeholders, and now we want to work with focus groups, interviews, and all of this really brings us to that a fund that will respond for the people needs to be developed by the people. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Isati, for your intervention and for bringing this dimension of the local communities being impacted by the consequences of climate change. So we've had the general top-down view on the roots of the emissions, the historic responsibilities, in order to talk about justice. We've now been introduced to the reality of local communities, in this case in Puerto Rico. And now I would like to invite to the floor to Laura Duarte. She's a legal advisor at the Business and Human Rights Program of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. And she's here today with representatives from Indonesia, Parit, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Riwanuddin and Eddie Mulonjo, and they will tell us about the climate litigation case being currently pursued by them from Indonesia. So, Laura, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Christian. And I also want to take my co-panelists because I think you have perfectly set the stage for our intervention, especially in terms of community participation. And we have the honor of having Eddie today and Parit with us from Indonesia, and they will be talking in detail about the case of the islanders of Parit versus the Swiss company Holcim. So we are very happy to have them here today. And as Christian was saying, I work for the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. We are a Berlin-based human rights organization, and since 2007, we have been using legal means to counter injustice around the world. One of the topics in which we work is business and human rights, and within that, which acts as an umbrella program, we have climate justice cases. And one of the cases we have been accompanying is, as I was saying, the case against the Swiss company Holcim. We have been supporting Eddie, Arif, Bobby, and Asmania in this case, which is the first transnational litigation in which plaintiffs and affected communities from the Global South, in this case Indonesia, bring a case in Europe against a Swiss company for reclaiming, among other things, compensation for past damages. So in that sense, it is a very novel legal strategy that we are pursuing. But as I said, we have Eddie here, so he will talk much more about the details of the case. But before I give the floor to them, I wanted to address one question, and it is why are we talking about corporate accountability within the framework of international climate negotiations? And there are several reasons, but the first one I would say is that we know for sure now that corporations have heavily contributed to climate change. Only 100 transnational corporations, the so-called carbon majors, have contributed to more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1998. And they have done so, as Isatis was saying, in order to favor the development of industrialized states and in the detriment of nature and people in developing countries and especially small island states. So they do bear a responsibility, not only towards the future in terms of reducing their emissions to be able to stay under the 1.5 limit established by the Paris Agreement, but also looking backwards in terms of providing reparation and compensation for the damages they have contributed to historically. And we have seen throughout the years, but also in this conference this year, how negotiations around loss and damages, and Adrian was referring to it, has been stagnated, and they are so complicated that the cases that we are trying to bring, and especially the case we are referring to today, which is part of a broader trend of climate litigation against corporations. You might have heard of the case of Milieu Defensier against Shell or the Peruvian farmer Luciano Lulia against RWE. What these cases are trying to do is also to point the fact that it is possible to attribute emissions to corporations, and it is possible that there are scientific studies that are able to attribute this link, and that previous rulings, like in the case of Shell, have shown that the corporations have human rights obligations that are related to climate. And this should be taken into consideration by states when deciding where the money will come from in order to comply with their obligation to repair and provide compensation to affected communities. And a second point that these cases are trying to make, and that fits very well with our setting today, is that they are providing a space of participation for those affected communities who are bringing their demands. So as we will hear now from Eddie, they are the ones who are feeding also the debate, in this case legally, but also politically, of what is it that is happening to their communities and what is it that they need and how they would to actually want to actually adapt. So in that sense, I consider this a very important development and a trend that is growing and that we should all support and relate also to the negotiations that are happening here. And with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Parit and Eddie because they have much more interesting things to say than I do. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih. Nama saya Edi Mulyono. Cerita soal iklim di tempat kami itu sudah terjadi, bahkan hampir 11% pulau kami sudah hilang karena akibat banjir rob, permukaan air laut naik ke pulau kami.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edi Mulyono. I am from Pari Island, a small island in Jakarta. So, my island has lost 11%, and almost every year, more than 5 or 6 times, since 2019, my island hit by tidal flood because sea level rise.
Ya, bahkan ketika terjadi di malam hari, itu membuat anak-anak kami tidak bisa istirahat atau tidur, bahkan mengancam keberlangsungan hidup masyarakat di sana. Dan kami juga berusaha untuk menggugat salah satu perusahaan Holcim di Swiss, dan saat ini sedang berlangsung di bulan Februari, sudah diterima oleh pengadilan di Swiss.
Yeah, so tidal flood usually come and hit in the midnight, and the children, they couldn't sleep, and in the morning they couldn't go to school because they still like in traumatic condition because of tidal flood, and also they lost many cage of fish because their main income come from fisheries, traditional fisheries. They lost big number of cage, and also they lost also income from traditional tourism. Yeah, because many tourists cancel when weather becoming bad, and based on this situation, Pari people, they discuss and decide to sue one big company in the world, especially in cement industry. There is Holcim, based in Switzerland.
Kenapa kami harus menggugat Holcim? Karena ini demi keberlangsungan hidup anak dan cucu kami ke depan. Bahkan bukan hanya kami yang tinggal di Pulau Pari, tapi juga masyarakat yang tinggal di pesisir dan pulau-pulau kecil.
So this climate litigation not only for themselves, or not only represent their community, but for their next generation, and also for millions people in global south who fight for climate justice.
Ada 3 yang kami tuntut ke Holcim. Yang pertama adalah mengurangi emisinya untuk supaya tidak dilakukan oleh Holcim, dan ada beberapa tuntutan kami juga. Yang kedua adalah Holcim bertanggung jawab atas yang terjadi di Pulau Pari, dan salah satunya adalah menanam mangrove sebanyak mungkin 2 juta lebih pohon mangrove.
So we have 3 demands. The first is they demand to Holcim to reduce emission until 60% until 2040. This is in line with IPC target. And the second demand is Holcim have to pay for adaptation way. There is 2 ways. The first is Holcim have to pay more than 2 million mangrove seeds for island protection from sea level rise. And the second one of adaptation is to build like small wall to protect the island from sea level rise. And the third demand is Holcim have to pay for lost for their loss and damage. So we have calculated the loss and damage, and we got in Swiss franc, money amount. There is 14,000 Swiss franc. Yeah.
Ya, ini salah satu upaya kami supaya mendapatkan keadilan iklim, dan kami berharap tuntutan kami dikabulkan oleh pengadilan.
This is one of our effort to get climate justice, and also hopefully this climate litigation can inspire to another peoples in global south to get their climate justice.
Ya, terima kasih.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And also, little bit, I am Farid Ridwanuddin. I am campaign manager for Marine, Coastal and Small Island from Friend of the Earth Indonesia. So we have big umbrella under Friend of the Earth International. We in Indonesia, we are the biggest archipelagic state. So we have more than 17,000 islands, and mostly small island, you can imagine. And then we have to face like the acceleration of sea level rise. And now in Indonesia, we have lost more than 26 small islands. And in the future, we will lose more than 115 small islands inside of our territory, and more than 86 in our border between Indonesia and, for example, Indian Ocean or Pacific Ocean. So this is big threat for us. And in the future, we also in Indonesia will face like the bomb of climate refugees. Yeah. So many people will lose their houses, their villages, their islands. So based on this situation, we strongly demand to all of global North countries, to agree the negotiation of loss and damage fund scheme for global South, and also as Laura said, we have to consider to attribute that global company in global North is big polluters, and so they have to reduce their emission, and also to pay the loss and damage for people like Pak Ede in small island. Thank you.
So thank you, Laura, Padid, and Eddie, for bringing this story, real story from Indonesia. I would like now to open the discussion to all of you. You've been hearing different stories, different perspective from the top-down approach in terms of responsibilities, in terms of historical emissions, and Isati and their friends from Indonesia with Laura have bring their own experience, their own litigation case against a corporation in Switzerland. Jennifer has a microphone, and I would like to open the floor if there are questions to the panelists. Please, there's one there. If there's more, we can take 2 or 3 questions and then we answer.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria Anaya. I am from Colombia, PhD student in law at Cornell University. And my question, I think, is for Laura. I know like you are filing this suit against this corporation, and I was wondering why you didn't, or whether you whether you analyzed another legal strategy of filing this lawsuit against Indonesia as a nation state for failing to protect their the community's human rights. And if that was the case, why didn't you choose to follow that path? And also I have a question for Eddie. And my question, well, I am a PhD student. I'm actually, my research is focusing on rights-based climate litigation and its impact in this kind of global scenarios and high-level decision-making scenarios. And I was wondering whether you think this, like being present here and talking and discussing about climate litigation could actually push governments to take climate action more seriously. Thank you.
There's another question at the back.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting to listen to. My name's David Williams from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and I was just wondering about the court case that we heard there towards the end. What was the strategic decision behind going after construction companies or a manufacturing company, which is wholesome, as opposed to traditional litigation processes which are normally aimed at sort of direct oil companies, whether it was a legal decision or whether it was other sort of more public awareness decisions about the incredibly damaging industry sector and their role also particularly in sort of CCS propaganda and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, thank you very much.
Last question, and then we go for the answers.
Thank you very much. And maybe just to add to the previous question there, what issues were dealt with in terms of standing in order to, I guess, at a procedural step before you got to the substantive case? I would be really interested to hear about hurdles that you experienced, if any. Thanks.
I think we can stay here by now, and I think, Laura, you have been asked.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. So on the first one, we as CEUS work mainly on transnational litigation, and we frame our cases against European corporations. So in that sense, we did not look into a strategy against the Indonesian state, but I'm sure Parit maybe could add on this, because while he is very active in Indonesia, and I think you have also explored this and you're working on a law, I don't know if judicial strategies have been analyzed, but I think, yeah, you would be better placed to reply to this question, Parit.
Okay, thank you. So we in Indonesia now, or not now, but since several years ago, we have been discussing and also documenting law on climate justice, or climate justice bill. So in national context, we build good awareness or consciousness or understanding for people in grassroots like AIDA, yeah, because they have to face the problem every day, but they don't really understand what the root of this problem. So we build discussion with the grassroots community, and in national level, of course, we encourage, we are developing climate justice bill. So this is also what one of our effort to deal or to inline with international movement on climate justice. And besides that, also we in Indonesia, we build a strong connection with youth, yeah, who have good movement, especially for social media, so they can campaign very strong to build a broader good understanding about climate justice. And our before we depart to Europe, to Germany, so we met with National Commission of Human Rights, with PAID and tens of PARI people. So from our discussion, our National Commission of Human Rights, they are developing national guidelines on human rights and climate justice. So this is good news for us, because based on our case, yeah, they consider and they are developing a good document for next or for our future. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Parit. So on the next question, so we have been working with HEX, which is a Swiss organization, and they had been working with Walhi and the islanders from Pari Island for several years. So there was a build relationship of trust. And that is the reason why we have decided to bring a case in Switzerland first. And when looking into major polluters in the country, Holcim came up to be one of the most polluting companies, especially after it merged with the cement company Lafarge. So calculating their historical emissions, it is really substantial. And as you were mentioning, cement is one of the most polluting industries, so it has contributed to more than 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions since industrial times. And Holcim in particularly has contributed 3 times what Switzerland emitted since 1951 until 2021. So it does bear a major responsibility in that sense. And so more than legally, I would say we had more of these strategic considerations in mind in terms of the amount of emissions and how it was calculated. And as per the last question, so I can also maybe as a context update a bit on the process of the case, the procedural stages of the case. So there was a conciliation request that was submitted last year in July, as it is requested by the Swiss civil code, because this case is a tort case, so we're using civil litigation. And there was a conciliation meeting in October 2022, which was unsuccessful. So as required by law, in January of this year, Eddie and the other plaintiffs have finally submitted the lawsuit. And we are now at the stage in which legal aid is being decided. So in terms of standing and substantial hurdles, I would highlight mainly 2. So the first one is that under Swiss law, it is not possible to bring class actions. So although their case represents a collective interest and it's on behalf of the whole community on the island, which, by the way, they have a very strong they're politically organized in the island because they have been also facing other conflicts. So it is really a collective effort that is being done. It was not possible to bring a class action. So it is only 4 plaintiffs that are representing the community in the case with their particular losses and damages. And the second one, I would say, is one of the most important and challenging aspects of bringing this kind of litigation is costs, especially for communities that are marginalized and that don't have the financial resources to access European courts. So we are fighting legally strongly to get legal aid for the plaintiffs so that the case can continue. And this is where we find ourselves at. And as per the course that the court has envisaged so far, it is so high that it might represent also a violation of the right to access to justice. So this is where we stand at now, and I would say those are the 2 main hurdles I would like to highlight now. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I don't know if there are more questions from the floor. No? So I can have some questions. There's no, right? Yeah, okay. So this is a question open to all of you. In the context of the UNFCCC process, it's supposed to be informed by science with the work of the IPCC. And I wonder if you think the IPCC addresses the climate justice matter and also the responsibility issue in a legitimate manner. Open question.
I can. Sorry. So in terms of the IPCC addressing justice, and how it relates to this process, I think parties here are conscious that it's an unjust process. That's basically it. But somehow the fact that they are unable to call it unjust, and the fact that they have no leverage to make it just, sort of makes us continue and cement the manner that developed countries are addressing and trying to avoid responsibility. And that is the basic of this process. It's a process that is built to avoid responsibility, countries that are here and that are trying to deal with fulfilling the goals of the UNFCCC, of the Paris Agreement, while at the same time knowing that the developed countries, the big emitters, do not want to have clear means to be held responsible, because the structure of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, as it is voluntary, especially the Paris Agreement, provides no means to hold them accountable. So that is we can go around and around talking about equity, but the system is built for the US, for China, and so on, and the European Union to not be held accountable. And on that premise, which we keep forgetting all the time, we build structures, procedures that will never hold them accountable and that are based on voluntary actions or pledges. And this is the bottom line. We will never reach equity on a system that is built to be unequal and to avoid responsibility. If we talk about loss and damage, and if you just read the IPCC ones, you will notice that it is a crisis. It is a huge, significant crisis, and there are sources of emissions that come from clearly from certain parties. But I've never heard a party from a developed country assume responsibility for what they have done. So on the basis of that, we will never be able to apply CBDR, because nobody accepts responsibility in this forum. So as long as that happens, we are in a structural, violent space where the objectives cannot be reached until we are sincere. And I think for as a Global South NGO, it would be more useful for them to say, no, we do not want to pay. We don't want to be held accountable, and because we are in power, that's life. And we will probably be more efficient to deal with that real politique of life instead of going around irrationally in building procedures that are not meant to work. And that is more honest for people. So I would not be here sitting today. I'll be working back home to deal with that reality. But I can't, because there is the slight chance that somehow, someday, these big polluters may recognize that I have rights and dignity. And as long as we concede to this procedure, I will claim my rights, even though they're denied, because I will not willingly accept injustice. But it might be more honest, and we would lose less money and time if you're just sincere that you will not fulfill your obligations under international law.
Thank you, Adrian. Would you like somebody else to react to the question I made about science? Is that this? Yes.
I mean, I wanted to comment, but after Adrian, I don't know. I would say that the most recent IPCC did mention loss and damage, which is a huge differentiation from the discourse, like, in past times. They wouldn't have gone into that aspect, and I think the IPCC is diving a little bit more into climate justice, and that will help really push like that science base. So it's not only, because a lot of it, normally when we talk about science base, they're like, oh, is it technological feasible? And that other piece of justice is missing. So I think the IPCC brings a very specific push that we could use, like, into that sphere of scientific base, although it's not enough. But one of the things that the IPCC did say is that civil society is the single motor to move institutions at the pace that is needed. And that is recognized by the IPCC, that is like, you know, what they consider the science with a capital S. So I think like we should like hold that and say like, look, the people that you trust are telling you this, so maybe we can find a way to do this. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Isatis. Olga, Oliver, any reaction on the question?
Yes, I think that fortunately civil society is here and has a big role to play because I think I agree with you that the only hope is that civil society will push and will put on the table proposals and put on the table numbers, analysis in order to reflect this huge problem that we have with our climate crisis. And because of that, we are here and we try to engage our students that are here in this process in order to raise voice of young people, people that want to change things. And for this, I think that we are here and we are trying to transform the reality. That's it.
Thank you, Olga. We still have a few minutes left. I want to be sure there's no more questions. And I would like to offer the floor to anybody of you to say a last word before we close.
Ya, mungkin pertanyaan tadi itu saya sih berharap untuk teman-teman karena ini adalah acaranya soal perubahan iklim, saya berharap menekan negara-negara untuk serius dalam menangani soal perubahan iklim dan bisa membantu apa yang sedang kami lakukan untuk memperjuangkan perubahan iklim. Terima kasih.
Yeah, Eddie said, so here we meet in international forum. So he hope that all of you can support and stand with him with his climate litigation against Holcim, and also can push and demand to all of Global North, both government and companies, to reduce their emission and to consider their loss and damage.
Thank you. Anybody else in the panel? Last word? Okay. So, we've seen the general context, responsibility historically, and how that could be an input for climate litigation cases. We've seen the experience of local communities, how they can mobilize in order to bring climate justice to the whole process. We've heard several critics to the UNFCCC process. We all know how that is going. So I just want to thank you again, Adrián, Olga, Oliver, Laura, Isati, Parit, and Eddie, for your big contribution to the discussion, to all of you that have been here during this session, and please, last round of applause.